Today's episode is a little bit different from anything I've posted on this channel before, and I'm excited to share it with you guys, but I'm also nervous to share it with you guys because today's guest is with somebody who I've really admired for a long time. I'm sure some of you are familiar with him. His name is Duncan Trussell. He's a comedian, a podcaster, and creator of the Netflix show The Midnight Gospel. And it was really surreal for me to get the chance to sit down and talk to Duncan. I mean, I've been a huge fan of him for years. I've been listening to his podcast, and he's been a big inspiration for me. So I was kind of intimidated going into this conversation. Over the years, I've been really lucky in that I've gotten to meet a lot of the people who have inspired me throughout my life. But these run-ins are usually pretty quick. Before or after a show, you might get a couple minutes to meet an artist and snap a picture with them, but you don't usually get much time to really interact. So I try to seize those brief opportunities and make an impression if I can. I always tell the person what a huge impact they've made on my life, and then I might show them a magic trick, or lately I like to give them one of our Rainworks art kits as kind of a unique souvenir to help them remember the interaction. And this is pretty much what I was expecting might happen when Duncan Trussell announced that he was going to do some stand-up comedy in Tacoma, Washington. I jumped at the chance to see him perform, and he was hilarious. I highly recommend getting tickets if he's going to be performing near you. And after the show, I got the chance to talk to him, as I have some of these other people throughout the years. But this time, something different happened, because I told Duncan that he'd been a huge inspiration for me and that I had recently launched a podcast largely inspired by him. And he was so excited and so enthusiastic and so supportive. And he was like, dude, we should do a podcast together. And I mean, I figured he was just being polite, but he actually did respond to me on Instagram. And before I knew it, we had a Zoom call booked for this podcast. So this is actually my first podcast episode that I've done over Zoom. When I started this channel, I actually made kind of a rule for myself that I only wanted to do in-person conversations because I think there's something about that energy of being in the room. And I think we're all kind of burnt out on Zoom calls after the pandemic. But I wasn't about to turn down the opportunity to talk with one of my heroes just because it was over Zoom. So this being a Zoom call was one of the big differences. The other thing that's different is that all of my past interviews were really hyper-focused on a particular topic, and I chose a guest that was knowledgeable about the subject I wanted to learn about. But this Duncan Trussell interview is a bit more all over the place. The guy's famous, at least relative to this podcast, so I didn't want to hit him with the same run-of-the-mill questions that he gets over and over again. But he's also a podcaster, so he's talked about everything before. So what do you ask a person like that? Well, I decided to take a pretty personal approach. There's a lot of themes that Duncan talks about on his podcast, things like philosophy, Buddhism, psychedelics, the paranormal, cults, and I decided to try to tie those topics into my personal life experiences. As a result, this ended up being probably the most personal episode of my podcast that I've recorded so far, and I feel kind of self-conscious about that. Part of me doesn't even want to release this episode. I just want to hide it away and keep it for myself, but Duncan agreed to do a podcast, not a social call, so I'm going to put it out there and see what you guys think. Let me know. Hope you enjoy.
Can you hear me?
Hey, there you are. Yes. Hello, Duncan.
How you doing? Can you see me?
I can see you too.
Okay, great. How you doing?
It's like magic. I'm doing so well. How are you, man?
I'm great. I'm in LA looking for a house right now.
Yeah. How's that going so far?
It's it's a really interesting time to be buying a house. Right?
Yeah.
It's cool though. We'll find a place.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you've been busy doing that, so I really appreciate you making the effort.
Yeah, you got it. Thanks for having me on.
It's so cool for me to be talking to you. Like for me, I've been listening to your podcast for years, and you've really been like one of my biggest inspirations. You were one of the reasons why I started a podcast myself.
Thanks.
So like for me, this is like getting to like record a song with like Paul McCartney or make a pair of shoes with Kanye West. This is a huge treat for me.
That's
so
cool.
Thank you so freaking much, Duncan.
Thanks for saying that.
So I want to start off a little bit by kind of touching on some of the reasons why I've connected so much with your podcast over the years. Because for me, I feel like I know you. Like I feel like you've been my teacher and my guru and so many things for me over the years. My entertainer, like you've just checked all these boxes, but I feel like you don't know me at all. So I want to take a moment and kind of tell you some of the things that I've gone through that have made me connect with the different stuff you've talked about.
Okay, let's hear it.
Starting off, I grew up in Humboldt County. Have you ever spent time in Humboldt County?
No, I haven't. I've seen some documentaries on Humboldt County, but I've never spent time up
There's
there.
some bizarre documentaries about it. Well, I grew up there with a bunch of old hippies. My mom was an old deadhead, traveled with the dead all through the 80s, did that whole thing, and then kind of settled down to be with me. So I was around a lot of psychedelic hippies, former deadheads, and my mom, for a big part of my childhood, was part of kind of a yoga cult. Not really another way to put it, but it was a whole chapter of my life and a
Holy
whole
shit.
kind of
How old were you when she left that cult?
I was probably about 10 or so when she left. My little sister was born shortly thereafter, and part of the reason they left was because they weren't big on having children.
Oh my God.
Cool.
Is that weird? Like cults, like they always want to kind of control the reproduction of their members. Like it's just across the board. Whenever you hear cult horror stories, it's either they're trying to fuck you or they're trying to make you not fuck. Like do you know what I mean? Like they really want to control humans.
Yeah,
like,
it's a
basic primordial things that make you a human. They like get their fingers wrapped around it. That's 10 years. Was she in it for the entirety of your life?
For a good portion of it. I mean, a lot of the people that I grew up around they were the people in this yoga group, and they all went by like these Hindu names. So, you know, like Ganesh and Shakti, and like even today, the person my stepdad, my mom left the cult with, I still refer to him as Hanuman. So like there's like all these kind of.
What was the name? Like where was the cult located?
They were in Humboldt County. They were called Standing Wave Yoga at the time.
Standing Wave.
Yeah, they're no longer together, and it never like, you know, there was never a big end to the story like you'd see on a Netflix documentary. They did not drink any Kool-Aid, to my knowledge, or at least my mom got out before that happened.
It sort of dissipated.
Yeah, exactly. The guy who was kind of the main leader of it all got very old and eventually passed away, and lost a lot of his followers in the time before then.
What was the name? What was that? What was his name?
His name was surprisingly normal. His name was Hal.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like not the name I was expecting.
yeah, for sure. So that was kind of like the context. And then Humboldt County itself was like a whole black market area. So like everyone grew pot. Everyone I knew grew pot. You couldn't ask the other kids what they were doing growing up because everyone's parents grew pot and it was secret. So like there was kind of this whole counterculture environment I grew up. I went to Burning Man twice right at the end of my teenage years, in 2011 and 2009. So I had a lot of kind of intense experiences there that I'd love to get into with you at some point.
Sure.
And then coming out of that, I moved up to Seattle, out of that area where I live now, and I've lived ever since. Probably 2 or 3 years after moving to Seattle, I met a Buddhist monk. His name's Lekshe. And I kind of got my fingers in the water of learning about Zen Buddhism and meditation and like all this kind of stuff. And it was probably 3 or 4 years after that that I picked up an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. And I'm like, wait, who's this dude on the Joe Rogan Experience talking about Ram Dass and like Burning Man? And like, I got to hear more of this stuff. And so ever since then, you've pretty much been like my top go-to podcast guy. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of, I guess, give you some understanding on where some of our common threads are.
Got it. Cool.
So to start off, let's talk about cults a little more. What firsthand, you talk about cults all the time, but what firsthand experience do you have with cults, Duncan?
Well, you know, the funny thing about listening to your story is like I have a group of people I call my satsang, and we gather in Maui for the Ram Dass retreats twice a year. And a lot of the like many times people have been like, is that a cult? And it's like, well, you know, I think like I spent a lot of time thinking about that. So what I did in the beginning when Raghu Marcus was letting me go to these things is I started trying to offend him. You know what I mean? On purpose, like saying
Yeah.
terrible things, like when I look back and I'm like, God, that was so rude. Like someone's like literally like hooking you up with this incredible like weekend in Hawaii, and you're like doing some rotten litmus test. But I think it's important, any spiritual community that you find yourself associating with, there, I think you do have to be a little stringent in your analysis of it. Regardless, um, my when I think about cults, I don't always think about them in the negative sense. You know, like, for example, when years and years ago, I started going to the Hare Krishna temple in Laguna Beach, California. And it's, if you read the writings of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, he calls it the cult of bhakti. So calling it a cult is not like, it's calling it one of the names for what it was, like a group. It's essentially like a cult, I think, is when a new reality tunnel springs up in default reality that is that consists of a group of people who have some way of thinking about reality that is generally wildly different than what we call secularism or whatever. But sometimes, and a lot of times, sadly, these fucking little mini bubbles of reality centralize around one person. And that one person is usually has all these qualities about them, which is generally they're charismatic, but also strangely authoritarian. You know, that's where I think it becomes a toxic cult. You know, that's where it's no longer like a community or a sangha, like what they talk about in Buddhism, but it gets toxic because now, instead of it inviting you to explore your own subjective universe and have autonomy and trust your own intuition and all the things that in Buddhism they invite you to do, like you're supposed to test it and check it and be very careful with your teachers. And anytime whatever the particular philosophy may be is sort of is put underneath a person, holy shit, you're in a fucking cult, man. You know what I mean? Like, it like plays on daddy issues and stuff. You know, like a cult leader will like tell you you're doing good because you are like, you aren't enough for you. You know what I mean? Some people, they need another person to be like, you're doing great. No, you really are doing great. And then it gets them off. And then they keep going back to that person. Will you tell me I'm doing great again? And at some point the person goes, what's wrong with you? You're fucked up, but I will fix you. And then, you know, and then the community celebrates that. And the next, yeah. So anyway, the cult, when I was at the Laguna Beach Hare Krishna temple, which I can't wait to return to one day, I was having a conversation there with one of the devotees, and I had read something that Prabhupada had written, and I said, I don't think I agree with this. And the devotee said, we don't say that we don't agree with Srila Prabhupada. We say we don't understand. And now I was like, oh, fuck, this is a cult. you know what I mean? Like, you want me? So okay, so I get it. So that person can never be wrong. That person can never be wrong. And also, you better not even say you think they're wrong. You know, you're not even allowed to express disagreement, but you can say that you're an idiot instead. You know what I mean? That's really insidious and spooky. So that was one encounter I had with a cult. And I still chant Hare Krishna to this day because, you know, regardless of the whatever's going on in the community, it's a cult. Ultimately, it's you got to get yourself out. You know, you're the one who has to be like decentralized, whatever the philosophy or teachings are, in a way that they're still accessible to you, but aren't like connected or rooted to one person, so that there's no dependency,
Yeah, I think that was a big part of, kind of the steps my mom took when she eventually left her cult. Is kind of like, yeah, in ways like her being in that group helped her grow the wings that allowed her to leave.
Exactly. That's right. Isn't that weird? That's a paradox. And this is why Ram Dass calls good spiritual teaching self-destructing traps, which is, and they do glue you in there for a second, maybe. Maybe you do find yourself really like into it, but then it evolves you enough to realize, oh, I don't need that. I can put that down. And that's, to me, I think that's a healthy and a good way to understand which you're in. And if you're in a place where you can't offend them, if you're in a place where you're afraid to be irreverent, if you're in a place where you get the sense that you need to get permission about anything in your life from them, or if you're in a place where you have a sense that there is some expression of omniscience or something like that, you know what I mean? If they can't say, I don't know, watch the fuck out. You better watch out. You don't want to be around someone who knows everything. Very dangerous.
So while we're kind of on the subject, I think it's so freaking cool that you got to kind of make a bond with Ram Dass towards the end of his life. I read Be Here Now maybe 5 years or so after I moved to Seattle, and it had such a big impact on me. And it was around the same time that I also had like a really impactful salvia experience. It was probably like the most profound psychedelic experience I've had, and I felt like I got knocked out of my body, and I was in another realm where I met a kind of a lizard person, and the lizard person.
Holy shit! Sorry, go ahead. And I'll ask you the question.
This lizard person, like they had scales, and I had scales too. Like I was also a lizard person in this realm, and this person was like, someone like my mother's age, it was like that kind of a relationship dynamic with me and this other like lizard person. They told me that life and death were going to be an illusion, and like I had to go through it now, and that there'd be a lot more shit to put up with. But at the end of it, like it was all just in my head, like, and it was just something I had to go through. Right. And that was like pretty much a turning point in my life in terms of like being open to spirituality. I was pretty like closed off to it before that, and pretty like strictly atheist. I had a very scientific mindset. And that all kind of shifted with that. And I ran into Be Here Now very shortly after I had that experience, and it just opened a whole portal for me. So I'd love to hear you just talk a little bit more about what your relationship with Ram Dass was like, actually getting to spend time with him towards the end of his life.
Sure.
And how that has had lingering effects on you as well.
Was the lizard, I will tell you that, but I must ask, just tell a story about an encounter with a mystical lizard person.
Yeah.
Was the lizard wearing clothes?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. Interesting. Was it an upright, like was it like a hominid? You know what I mean? Like
yeah. They were
like
a hominid. They were standing on two legs, and yeah, we were just kind of having a face-to-face conversation.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, cool. Yeah. So, I have a very skeptical mind too. And very cynical. I'm habitually cynical if I'm not careful.
Yeah.
Like really nihilistic and cynical. And so I was like, when I first started making actual contact with the community around Be Here Now and stuff, I was fully prepared to be disappointed, just as a natural sort of sense of like, this stuff is beautiful and it's cool to read, but in practice, let's see what it's probably a scam, or who the fuck knows, or it's cheesy or whatever. So before I met, Ram Dass, I met Raghu, and it was just the coolest thing, because Raghu is just authentic as he is, all the good stuff, all the stuff he's working on. He's not, you know what I mean? It's a person to me who felt human and not like, I don't know how to put it. He was funny and authentic and like just normal. And so, but he it was the first time I'd ever run into any of these people. He left, and I recorded a podcast with him actually. And I remember going and looking at myself in the mirror and thinking, wow, you shouldn't have gotten so stoned around Ragu for the podcast. That was rude. And then I realized, like, I'm not stoned. We didn't smoke anything. I was just high from being
Yeah.
around that energy. And that was really amazing and and really confusing to me. So when I met Ram Dass, and saw, not like Ragu obviously, but the same kind of energy. Like, what is this? What is this, like, funny, loving, compassionate, forgiving, like, what is this? And then I began to realize, oh, this is Neem Karoli Baba. Like, this is what Maharaji gave them, so to speak, and the whole, there's so many Ramdas. That's what, there's this, God, there's a term, it's called cynicism. And Brian Eno came up with it. Basically, anytime there's a Brian Eno, there's a community around that Brian Eno that some people will never meet or know. But these were the people who, like, were Eno's friends and people who was making art with. And the same is true for, like, anybody like that. And so what's wonderful is, like, around Ram Dass were all these other Ram Dasses that maybe people aren't so familiar with, but it's the same energy. And that's a really wonderful thing. And that's where, when I was talking about the dangers of centralization, that's what's, like, when you're in a place where you realize, oh my God, it can't centralize, because there's, like, so many different versions of Ram Dass about, and they all have their own sort of, like Krishna Das, he plays music, and he's got obviously a completely different personality, but that thing is just as much with him as with Ram Dass, as with Raghu, as with any of them. So that was a really interesting epiphany that I had, and that's how I understand the Sangha, or like, apparently they asked Buddha, what do you think's most important of the three jewels, the Dharma, the Buddha, or the community, the Sangha? And he said, oh, it's the community. It's the community is the most important, meaning that if you could go back in time to meet the Buddha, you would be wasting your time, because you're meeting the Buddha when you encounter the community of Buddhists. That's the mind of, that's the awakened mind, or the Gestalt, or whatever you want to call it. And so, yeah, that was a really cool thing. And obviously meeting him in the person and being around someone who has poured their entire life into understanding love is just wild. And I feel incredibly lucky.
One of the feeling you're describing, being in that aura, that presence of someone like that. I mean, I felt the same thing when I spent time with the Buddhist teacher I mentioned before, yes, where, like, it's like, wow, like, this guy just radiates this, like, loving feeling.
Yeah.
And something that he and I would talk about that I'd love to run by you is we talk about, like, the difference between trying to, like, be the Buddha outside of the world versus be the Buddha in the world. The Buddha got to climb to the top of a mountain, and it's, even Ram Dass, at least in his later years, he spent his time in Hawaii. It's very nice to be here now when you're sitting in Hawaii, yeah. But for the person who's, working in an office in the middle of the city and isn't so happy with the surroundings at that moment,
yeah.
How do you, I think you've been a really good example of someone who really engages with the outer world, and you really try to bring that spirit, like, everywhere you go. Can you just talk a little about that difference, about, like, sure, being a Buddha in isolation versus being a Buddha when you have all the world's energies to work around?
First, let me just say, the first time I met Ram Dass, I talked to him, was a Zoom call. And because I was on the website and you could just schedule a talk with him, I couldn't believe it. And so I just signed up not thinking it was real. And then I just get this call, like, yeah, hi, it's Ram Dass. And then suddenly I'm talking to Ram Dass, and I said, how are you doing? And he laughed. He goes, I'm in Hawaii. I'm great. But that being said, this is a person who was in a wheelchair, who used to be able to play cello and like to drive, like, it was like into the world, was like, and had aphasia, so his speech slowed down. And here's like one of the great spiritual teachers, one of the great translators of the Eastern lineages, who has to very slowly express themselves. And to me, that was one of the many things about him that was astounding, is that where many other people, like, if I have a headache, I'm done. I'm like, I'm not doing anything. I can't talk to anybody. Or if I'm around people and I have a headache, no matter how much I love them, my friends, or if I'm hungover, I'm just like, oh, won't you just be quiet, please? Like, whereas Ram Dass was like dealing with a lot that goes along with getting old, and somehow just maintained this present moment, compassionate, loving field around them. And one of the, I don't even want to call it a problem, but he had people taking care of him. And Ram Dass would spend the night, like, if Ram Dass would sit with someone for hours, you know what I mean, who was grieving, or just all he wanted to do was to be a servant, even in that sort of state that he was in. Now, as far as I'm concerned, for me, I haven't gotten to the point of like that comes from many incarnations, I think, if you want to get woo-woo, but certainly much discipline, and a real and not discipline like, you love to read spiritual books or talk about spiritual things, but many of these people have taken year-long retreats. People who have like have taken intentional, deep dives into ways of being that are not traditionally convenient. You know what I mean? It's, no one wants to sit still for like a 10-day Vipassana retreat. But what about a year? What about a year? Some of these, like Jack Kornfield, he didn't talk for a year. So as far as I'm concerned, for me, it's more of a kind of like a survival issue for me, because I have anger problems. I'm impatient, and I'm easily confused. I get depressed. There's so many aspects of my personality that, I'm in therapy. You know what I mean? I need some way of not getting so concretized into my identity, or I'll turn into an asshole. So learning about how to stay still, and learning about how my mind is not really a consistent thing to refer to when it comes to trying to understand myself, because my mind, my thought patterns, when you meditated at all, you really will quickly understand how chaotic your thought patterns are, and how impermanent, and how probably they aren't the best place to anchor your identity necessarily. But I need a thing that keeps reminding me of that, so that I don't get contracted into my fear state, or my thinking patterns too much, so that I can get a little bit of space to be slightly less afraid, because anger is just hot fear, as they say.
I want to, while we're kind of on this topic of like Buddhism and spirituality and stuff, I want to kind of talk about attachment. And something I've struggled with a lot, like during the pandemic, especially, is like, I guess, struggling with the level of attachment that's, I guess, optimal for the human experience, in terms of like, there's, the Buddhists are always talking about, being an observer to your thoughts, being an observer to the universe. And then there's kind of like this, like, attachment is what leads to suffering idea, but then it feels like, especially the pandemic brought out like the hard lines of like where that becomes really hard, when like suddenly you're talking about, the health of someone you love, that's something I really struggled with like, I have a lot of people close to me who chose not to get vaccinated,
Yeah.
and realizing that I can't change that decision for them, that they're in that mindset, but
Yeah.
feeling like really struggling, I guess, to surrender to them making that decision, when it feels like if there's anything we should be attached to, it should be the well-being of the people we love.
Yeah.
So how have you found a balance in terms of being an observer, but also, the thing that makes life worth living is to some degree our attachments. So where do you find your balance there?
Oh, okay. Well, okay. So, the term itself, attachment, it's so easy, like it has many different meanings and many different gradients, I guess you could say. Um, this is something Chogyam Trungpa talked about with the meditation practice. It's like you're essentially using finer and finer grades of sandpaper as you begin to like work with your attachments. And so initially, when I was thinking about attachment, I would think like, I remember thinking like attached to money, attached to greed. I would think about it as a greedy thing or something like that. And then I realized, oh, right, yeah, it's not really just about being attached to pleasure or anything like that. It's more about being attached to your family and your friends and not wanting them and your pets and um, not wanting them to die because you're so attached to that particular form that they're in. And so for that attachment to even work, it requires a sort of ignorance, sort of, right? Like you really do have to ignore the fact that anything around you is incredibly impermanent and incredibly fleeting. I mean, that's just
Yeah.
that's the way it is.
Yeah.
There's no way around that. That's not even Buddhism. That's just the reality is we are on a spinning centrifugal sort of planet that has sentient organisms on it that are slowly, hopefully, or some rapidly in the process of sort of melting into nothingness. So that's just truth. And so if you're going to try to pretend it's any other way than that, if you're going to imagine like this is a crystallized singular person who I can sort of take for granted and is always going to be the way they are, then you are in for some pain. I mean, there, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, yeah, it's like putting your hand in a fan. You know what I mean? The fan's spinning, no matter how you want to think about it. It's not going to change the fact that if you stick your hand in a fan, it's going to fucking hurt. And you know what I mean? So I think so in Buddhism, it's not as though it's inviting you to do an unnatural thing. It's simply pointing out this sort of reality. Like, look, that's an electric fence. If you touch it, you're going to get shocked. And so this is, I think, what attachment means. And then, so it goes from, beginning to understand that we are constantly changing, and that within that constantly changing reality, we are projecting solidity onto things that go beyond our dog and our friends or whatever, right? So that we're also like coming up with like very specific concepts about what reality is and how it works and who we are and who other people are and what things are and why things are the way they are, all the way down to like language. You look at an A, the symbol, and you see an A. It's that quick and instantaneous. Before you learn to read, those were just symbols on squares. But now that you have learned how to read, they're no longer symbols. They have this meaning that you've imbued them with from a lifetime of reading and being taught how to read. So that is an even finer grade of attachment, in the sense that there is a, for lack of a better word, a sort of attachment to our concepts too. And so I imagine it gets it goes even deeper than that, but that's just about as far as I've gotten in my own process, and I don't really stick around there that long anyway. That being said, the real question here is who is attaching? What is attaching? I think maybe that's where it gets even finer, is you start realizing, oh shit, even the thing that thinks it's being attached is, I don't think it's real. It's real as any of this other stuff is. Now, maybe somewhere in that process, something starts happening where in the midst of all of that emptiness, as they call it, you begin to experience spontaneous compassion, or a kind of a kind of capacity to be with people that isn't quite as informed by all the fear and pain that goes along with trying desperately to hold this wild, flowing thing that we find ourselves in, like trying to freeze it like an ice cube or force it into some shape. Somewhere in that, like sort of giving up that battle, maybe. And again, I can only report in from as far as I've gotten with it, which isn't that far at all. But there's a little more compassion there. There's a little less connecting to whatever identity a person you might be around has really decided to amplify, and has really decided to like constrict around. There's a way to be in the presence of them without being quite so defensive yourself, without getting caught up in whatever they're going through, because you recognize, oh, I know what's going on with you. I've the same things fucking happening to me all the time too. And so maybe there's a little compassion there. But then that's all. After that, it's a little bit of just, I've read that if you continue this sort of thinking, that there a kind of liberation happens that isn't sporadic or as chaotic as what I can report in from my own personal experience.
So continuing down based on what you're saying, I mean, a lot, you talk about impermanence, and we talk about the constant change that's always happening and everything. And in some ways, when I think about that, it drives me down a cynical like lane, where it's like, okay,
Yeah.
if we're just observers and everything's impermanent, and does anything matter? And therefore, like, why do anything? Why put energy out? And so how do you stay motivated then?
Okay, right. Well, here's the good news. That thing, the cynical thing, again, from my own personal experience, that's just your ego. And that thing gets cynical.
That guy again.
Well, yeah, and why wouldn't it be cynical? Because this is very threatening to it in a certain way, because the initial sort of, you think, oh my fucking God, well, if all that's true, then what's the point? But this is still an intellectualizing of the reality of the thing. So in the intellectualization of the thing, this is where we can come up with all kinds of nihilistic, cynical ways of looking at the world, a world of change and impermanence, and there is no real meaning, and if there's no meaning, there must be no truth. If there's no truth, then we're just chaotic blasts of matter that is temporal, like basically malfunctioning. I mean, really, what could be the worst thing that could possibly happen to an impermanent thing than for it to suddenly gain some fleeting self-awareness, just enough so that it's scared of dying? That would be a fucking disaster. If you're intellectualizing it, it's catastrophic even. And so there's a concept in Buddhism known as fundamental goodness, or this sort of essentialness, a reality that is called emptiness. And I think that emptiness is a very confusing term, because for me, in the West, I think we've almost been conditioned by capitalism to see empty as bad. The more you have, the better. Empty, not so good. And so that emptiness is compassion. So that's the good news. The good news is you begin to realize that, oh, all this stuff in relative reality, as it's called, all this stuff, it is in a certain way there isn't real value in it. It doesn't really mean anything. It's essentially neutral, but it's confusing and magical, in that you begin to imagine, well, that is where I will find this feeling of love that everyone wants and everyone intuitively wants, or that's where I'll find it. That must be it over there. Some people think it's a certain amount of money in the bank account. Some people think it's their body looking a certain way. Some people think it's achieving or obtaining something they don't have. And that is a normal way to get confused. So how exciting to find out that in fact that all that thing you were looking for actually isn't dependent in any way on any of these things, but is sort of the womb within which these things are being temporarily suspended, for lack of a better word. It's the space within which it's so compassionate that it's giving all this space for this Leela, or this incredible game of matter, to happen. And so it's sort of like when you're in a dream and you're getting chased and it's fucked up, and then you remember you're in a dream and you go, oh, I'm in a dream. I don't have to be scared. Oh my God, I fully was buying into this. And then you have this natural sense of relaxation that comes. Or other ways it's been described is a prisoner is told, you're going to be out of jail in 2 weeks. Your life sentence is, we were wrong. We're setting you free in 2 weeks. Even if you were still in prison, there's going to be a sense of relief or something. And I think this emptiness, or bodhicitta, as it's called, as I've heard it's called, and is instantly accessible. And it is in the way that Buddha says there is suffering. There's also not suffering too, because everyone gets caught up in the first and second noble truths, but no one wants to talk about the third and fourth. And the third and fourth are about the end of suffering too. We're just so fucking familiar with suffering, it's easier to talk about.
That's true. I mean, you know, making the fourth step be like 8 more steps was kind of cheating, you know?
Yeah, right. I never thought of that. You get to the fourth and you're like, wait, what the fuck? There's 8. And then in some of those steps, there's more steps.
Yeah. Duncan, I'm curious, what's your take on manifestation lately, both on an individual level and like on a collective level?
I'll tell you. I just realized I didn't really answer your last question. What I'm saying is, we are in the world and there are responsibilities and things to do. And this is known as relative reality. So in Buddhism, it's not just that there's this absolute reality, which is what we were talking about, the infinite, or the what do they call it? The great immeasurables is what they're called. So these sort of like reservoirs of awakened consciousness or enlightened mind, that everything is sort of like appearing in like some kind of fireworks show or something. Sure, great, whatever, but I still have to fucking pay my rent. I have to feed myself. I have to keep my family safe. I have to keep me sheltered. I have all kinds of things to do in the world that are completely, no one gives a, if fucking Bank of America calls you because you overdrafted your card, they're not going to be like, oh, okay, well, we'll forget the overdraft fee, when you're like, you know, we're all emptiness, right? So therefore, you know, you really shouldn't really care about this. You got to pay the fucking ticket and the fines and all the earthy stuff too. So one is absolute reality. One is relative reality. If you get out of balance in your experience of these two realities, then you're either going to become a nihilist or cynical, or you're going to become like an eternalist, or someone who is like, you know, fixating on a kind of infinite, unchanging reality. And so Buddhism is the middle way. So it's like sort of being in between, or letting these two realities coexist as they do naturally anyway. There's not much you could do about it. The two are always playing a game with each other, and have been, I think, for a very long time. So that's to answer your question. You still got to pay your fucking bills, and but how wonderful if there's a way to not to be 10% less freaked out when you're paying your bills. You know what I mean? Possibly not freaked out at all. Again, I can only report on my own subjective experience, but they say there might be a way that you actually no longer suffer. You know, I just don't, I've only heard that. I haven't experienced it myself. So as far as manifestation goes, it works. I've used it. I still use it. I think that you can understand manifestation so easily. Like a lot of these things are very easy to understand. And by not, because you hear a thing like, oh, I can manifest or whatever. And my mind is like I used to go to this wonderful place called Agape Church. You ever heard of it? Michael Beckwith's church?
I haven't, no.
Oh, it's incredible. And it's a church that teaches manifestation. It's just a beautiful thing. But I remember that at one point the church was having a sweepstakes for a car.
Sure.
And I kept thinking like, so like the person who wins the car, what, were they the best manifester in the church or something? You know what I mean? Like, what, the rest of us just suck? Like, I thought this shit worked for everybody, you know? And so, so I get that. And if we look at this from a kind of in a scientific way, or we want to start writing experiments for like some of the many flaws in this manifestation idea, which is that if you start applying it globally, how do we, is this just a cheap way of dealing with the problem of evil in the world? You know what I mean? Like, wait, so you're saying like the famine, the place where there's famine and all those people are starving to death and the children are dying? What, they can't manifest food or something? Is it not working for them? And in some weird implied way, is it their fault? So you don't have to feel as guilty about it anymore, just because you can, in some subconscious sense, be like, well, should have manifested some food, I guess. But, you know, so am I like trying to like make it like exploring all the problems with it? I find some real issues, but in the practice of it, in the basic way, which is that if you go out into the world with a consciousness that is steeped in fear and anger and disappointment and bitterness and all the things that come to a person in a life and some version of that, then because much of what we see in the world is our own reflection, we're going to see that all around us. We're either going to see people who don't deserve what they have, enemies, people who are out to get us, or people we have to overcome to get what we want. And so if this is the way that you're thinking, then you can only expect people to react to that. You've turned them into that naturally. You can do this experiment so easily. Just go out, walk down the street, and act like you're angry, really mad, stomp around and walk down the street all pretending to be angry. Don't do it that long, you might get arrested, but do it for a little bit and watch how people react to you when you pass. They'll move out of the way. They're scared of you, they get the fuck out of the way. So as above, so below. This doesn't just happen when you're on the street. You know, it happens everywhere. It's your own, where you're at in your particular, wherever you may be. If you're walking around slouched, unhappy, people are going to think you're unhappy and they're going to relate to you as an unhappy person. If you can change your physiology and can change the way you're walking and can really, I mean, if you get into Ernest Holmes, begin to live as though you already have that thing that you are longing for, then just in that practice, you become magnetic and stuff starts happening. Maybe you don't, you know, maybe not an exact replica of what you had in mind, but it's always worked for me, man. It just doesn't work on your timeline or on your, you know, it doesn't work in the steps you've come up with for how to get the thing you want. You know, you almost have to surrender that shit too, and just know that you already have it. That's it. Ernest Holmes, check it out. Mitch Horowitz is so good at talking about this stuff, but yeah, I think it works. I know it works.
It's one of those things that I again got kind of thrown off course on my ideology around it when COVID hit, because like I was very much of the mindset, like the external world is a reflection of the internal world, but then it's like, what what did I do to make COVID happen? Like
Yeah,
when you think about that, and then suddenly the whole world shuts down. It's like, whoa, did I make what was going on in my psyche that turned the like
there
made
you
this
go.
kind of come out of left field, and it complicated things. I felt like in
Well,
terms of
this is where you go nuts. I mean, this is one of the sand traps of this sort of thing, is like solipsism. If you don't look out, you can accidentally find yourself imagining that, you centralize yourself. You centralize yourself, and um, you end up in the same fucking place you were. You're just like you've just trapped yourself in some. Anyway, I think this is what Robert Anton Wilson talked about when he was talking about the chapel perilous. And anyone who gets into magic, this is one of the warnings that is like, watch out, because once you start working with this stuff and recognizing how much more powerful you are than you thought you were, whatever, however much of you is like defined by your lack or limitation or whatever, well, it's not going to be able to exist anymore. So many people define themselves by their inability to get something, or their lack, or their limitation. And there's weirdly something very addictive about that way of being too. But yeah, man, I think it's this is why it's good to have some kind of community, so that if you get too caught up in that idea that you're talking about, that you're God, everything around you is somehow part of your mind or whatever like that. I mean, that sometimes it can lead to a dark place.
certainly can, yeah. And it's just like, I think you're right that the isolation of quarantine also amplified into all this kind of stuff, where it's like the
Yeah.
more you go into your own head and the less you're actually talking out these kinds of ideas with other people, the further down a rabbit hole you'll end up going.
And, Neem Karoli Baba would never take credit for the crazy mystical things that were happening around him. He would always say, it's not me, it's God. This isn't me. And I think that's a very important shift that will cure you if you get too caught, if you find yourself suddenly imagining that you're in a dream, that you're the nucleus of some kind of dream, and everybody else is like an NPC or something floating in that dream.
And I don't think it's even so much that as it is kind of that manifestation idea that like if you believe enough, more people will believe, and together you will, create the world that you're trying to envision.
Yeah,
But then, yeah, that can get knocked off its horse and occasionally as well. And yeah, it's an interesting thing to
it's
grapple
a
with.
fun one. No matter, I mean, the way I see it, don't get too caught up in the big stuff. I mean, you don't need to worry about that anyway. I mean,
And
like, really,
honestly,
yeah,
that one of the things that you said a lot during the pandemic that really helped me kind of stay away from that mindset and focus on things was repeated it over and over, was tend to the garden you can reach. And that became a
that's
mantra for
important.
me.
Yeah, yeah,
And it
yeah, that's it.
really, it was like a good way to get my head, like zoom in on what was actually going on in my life.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you for all of that, because that was all stuff that's been on my mind a lot, and it's really cool to actually be able to bounce that kind of stuff off of
Oh,
you.
thanks for great questions.
To maybe lighten it up a little bit for a minute here, you're the first of a few different things on this podcast. You're my first other podcaster that I've had. You're also the first comedian that I've had on the
Awesome.
podcast. So I want to ask you a little bit about both those things, starting with podcasting, because clearly this is something I'm trying to get into. I'm curious, how do you go about finding guests? How do you go about deciding who's going to be on the podcast, and what sort of prep do you go into those conversations with?
Right. Well, okay, so it's evolved over time. Initially, it would just be comedians and people that I knew, and then I started reaching out to people that I thought would be really interesting to talk to. Then when the podcast got popular, I'm lucky because publicists and stuff will reach out to you and say, "What about this guest or that guest?" Or people will just reach out to you that you can't believe are listening. And so, but now I have an assistant, and my assistant, I will tell her like, okay, here are like 10 people that I would love to have on the show. And I just give her the names, and who knows, maybe it works, maybe it won't, but she reaches out to them. And, I have the Midnight Gospel to show that, look, this cartoon was made about it. So people maybe will be more likely to say yes. So I do it based on my own interests. Like someone might, there might be a possibility to interview someone for the podcast who's famous or something, but I know I'm not, like, I don't understand enough about them, or I'm not into whatever they represent. And so then it won't be then I imagine my listeners won't be as interested, so I try to make sure whoever it is that I'm talking to, that I'm excited or into it. And then the prepping process, I try to, like, obviously, like, thank God for Wikipedia, really makes it easy to research people, but that's often dated and shit. You never know. So as another trick is, generally most people you're talking to, they've already done a million interviews. So you can go and look at the questions that have been asked already. And you'll find that there's this repeat question that keeps happening over a span of various interviews. And if you want your guest to go into autopilot, ask them those questions, because they've already answered them a billion times, and they'll just do this thing. Now, sometimes they want you to ask those questions because it helps them promote whatever it is they're promoting, which is really one of the reasons they're coming on your show, is because it's like they're trying to signal boost something. So, I mean, I'm not saying don't ask them those questions, but also try to come up with at least 5 other questions, just like what you did. You're asking me shit that you're wondering about yourself. So have something. I always try to find, what am I working through right now? And maybe these people can help me figure this shit out. And then I'll make that some of the questions. And then make sure you have a few questions based on whatever their life is. So it doesn't seem like you've been lazy. Because man, there's nothing worse than when you find yourself in an interview and you realize, like, this person doesn't is just doing a show and is having guests on and stuff, but they don't really, they're not really interested in me, or they're not having me on because they have some interest. They just are like trying to make content. And they'll be like, so now what are you best known? I've had someone ask me, what are you best known for? And you're like, what the fuck are you? What question do you want me to answer that? That's an embarrassing thing to try to answer. You're like, God, I don't know, man. I mean, I'm stinky. My like me, but I don't, I don't know. It's so just, I think, part of the job is most certainly doing research. And anytime that I've been lazy and haven't done that, I've always felt like a real like really not very professional.
Well, that is a perfect segue. First of all, I want to just give my appreciation for Midnight Gospel, because that show is a masterpiece, and you really, I think you elevated the whole field of podcasts with that. I'd love to hear a little bit about what your work with the animators was like, because like those animations, I felt like I was watching one of your monologues from your podcast. Like it was like, I felt like I could hear you telling the animators like, oh yeah, and then this is crazy. Like and so like, yeah, just would love to hear about like how hands-on were you in terms of working with the animators?
Well, that was what was cool about working with Pendleton, is he let me more hands-on than he needed to. He let me in,
Did he do all of the animation, or did you guys have other animators?
He drew a lot of we had a team of just incredible design artists who were making a lot of the images for the show and characters for the show. Jesus Christ.
I figured.
Geniuses. And it was the best when you realize, I mean, it's like, in Star Trek, they had those matter assimilator things, like it'll just make you like a ham sandwich or whatever.
Yeah.
You start realizing like, holy shit, I could just tell them something that I want to see. And the more weird and kind of like not too detailed, so they get to like do their version of whatever you're saying, the more they like it. They like it. So it's the coolest thing ever, just to like come up with like ideas and then seeing the way they interpret it. Or like my friend Brendan Walsh wrote the beats for the Annie Lamont episode with the deer dogs who get scooped up by um, bulldozers and injected with namastex. But like, you know, in the script, it was just deer dogs. Like we didn't know what they were going to turn them into. And then they like will show you all these different, what do you think about this version or that version or that version? This is where you
Wow.
really collaborate. So you pick out, okay, I like that, I like that, I like that. Now it's granular, man. It gets deep. And I didn't go to all those meetings. Like it gets deep. This is what I didn't understand about animation. Like anything you see in any animated show, like an object on a table, the way the characters are dressed, there's theoretically days of sitting in a room looking at design for every little piece of that, going over every square inch of every second to look for any flaws, anomalies, anything at all. It's you scrutinize it. And these people, they are like the animation world. It's just, they're so fucking good at it. They're so good at spotting like the tiniest micro flaw, shit that you would never notice in a million years. Like, oh, that brick, the shading on the brick is, and then they use animation terms like a formula to zigzag on the zomalan. It's like wizards. They're wizards. They're wizards. And so I didn't go to those meetings because that would just be intrusive, I think, and pointless for me. But with some of the like with many of the characters and stuff, they just run it by you. The way the simulator looks, you know, all or Pendleton would like whatever Pendleton or any of them made was they were just geniuses. So a lot of what I did was try to not get in their way too.
Well, it came out so good, and it's really just one of the best things on Netflix. I've recommended it to everyone I know, and a couple of them have actually followed up on that recommendation.
Thank
And
you
those
so much.
people were the people who ended up loving it. So,
Thank you. I feel so lucky we got to make that. I really do. I can't believe they let us make it.
is there a plan for a season 2?
Not right now. No.
What about a comedy special? Are you gearing up for something with the tours you're doing?
Yeah. But you know, I'm not going to talk about it too much because it's in, you know, deeply in development right now. But yeah, for sure.
We'll keep that zip then. But I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you.
I feel like there's not enough of your stand-up available online. I know that you've been
There
doing
isn't.
it for a long time, but that was one of the reasons that when you were coming to the Pacific Northwest, I'm like, I gotta go see this guy because I've been wanting to see what he's like in a stand-up environment. And the show that I saw of yours is that first show in Tacoma, and you had that one drunk heckler who ended up taking a lot of the attention away from the show. And that was my, I mean, I've been to a lot of comedy shows over the years, but that was the most a heckler has ever disrupted a show that I've seen. Wow. But the way that you handled it was like, I felt like I was watching like a master, like a captain, like navigating during a storm, like the way you were like reading the energy of the room and like redirecting it and like having the crowd ohm for her. Like that was just something I've never seen before, but it was so beautiful and powerful. And yeah, I think you've got a real knack for it, and I can't wait to see what you'll end up producing when you put together a full show.
You know, that's the first time I've ever ohmed a heckler with the audience. I've never done that.
I was wondering if that was like your go-to or
first of all, like she was like sort of like the worst kind of heckler because like that person had gotten to a level of drunkenness where they didn't know what they were doing. And like they like for her, she like sometimes people just when they're that drunk, they get caught in this loop because, you know, they're trying to redeem themselves. Like, obviously you shouldn't yell out at a show, but because they were drunk and they yelled at a show, then they want to explain why they yelled out at the show. You know what I mean? Like to redeem themselves. But like so they keep repeating the initial thing. And it's like, well, it's like sinking in quicksand or something, you know, you just are going to get deeper and deeper into a rotten situation. Because I mean, you don't have an amplification mechanism. You know what I mean? So you're already like just technologically in trouble no matter what. But I felt bad. She was like a fan, and I felt bad for her because I didn't like some hecklers are just like mean or something, and then it's like there's less of you're just like get out. Like, what are you doing? What's wrong? You could be a little.
you tried so hard to handle it with compassion, and she just didn't know when to stop. And I could see you really trying to like get that message to her, like this can be over. Like we can
Yeah,
all move on.
but also I think also like is like I think yeah, there's a it's good to understand the different forms of, to be able to identify the different forms of heckler out there, because there's many different types, and the great majority of them, like any well-written monster, they don't think they're doing anything bad. They're trying to
Yeah.
help, you know.
She
Um,
thought she was on a podcast with you, not at a comedy show.
yeah.
Um, so here's something I want to ask about. One of the things I really admire about your career, whether it's Midnight Gospel or the podcast or the stand-up, is that it really feels like you have I mean, it looks like this way from the outside. Maybe it's different from the inside, but it really looks like you have managed to not sacrifice what's important to you in your work. And it seems like so many creative people and people who are trying to make it in comedy or in Los Angeles, you know, in the industry, like end up making sacrifices to be able to, you know, achieve some level of fame. What is your advice, I guess, for up and coming creatives who want to figure out how to pursue their creativity without making those sacrifices? Because I think you're a great example of someone who's done that.
Well, I mean, thank you. And you know, actually, you probably didn't see. You haven't seen all the like when you're trying to like get into the business, you are going to have to make compromises. Like you're not gonna. It's not like you're gonna be able to just all of a sudden start like getting funded by a network or something to make a show. Like you need to, there it's good to like start working on shows in any way at all, or start having like, what's cool about the Comedy Store is you start out, it's like the door guys or the door girls are also comedians, and they're learning how to do stand up, but they're also watching a club, and they're seeing like, you know, famous comedians, and so they're getting this like message of like, look, this is possible, this can work, you can actually have a career in this. And sometimes you see where it doesn't work, which is good too. So I think that you just know the difference between integrity and ego, right? Like if you think you're too good to work on something, you're probably like, something might be fucking up. Because so like I did commercials, I went on commercial auditions, I almost stepped on a parrot at a commercial audition in Culver City. I was so bad at doing commercials. Really, what, here's the thing, I wasn't good enough to sell out. I didn't get to the point where I could do some shitty commercial and then being, you know, like, oh fuck, I'm doing a McDonald's commercial or whatever. Not because I was like, I'm not taking that audition, but because they didn't want me. And sometimes people don't want to like say that. They want to act like, oh no, I'm like too, I said no to all that stuff. Fuck that. I had to pay rent. Roaches were crawling on my face, man. I was living in this shitty studio apartment in Echo Park with no air conditioning. I would sweat into the fucking keyboard when I was trying to write. You know what I mean? So that being said, sometimes you do need to say no. And the reason you should say no is because you don't think that project is right for you or is interesting. Because fuck, if you say yes to something you don't really want to do, that's not fair for all the people working on the project who do want to do it. And so that sucks for all involved, mostly you, because you're not going to have the excitement you need, you know, to get into a thing. So, but I didn't, you know, I anytime I see a comedian who has managed to make a career out of their comedy, I'm like I used to, when I was much younger, be like, look at that sellout, or oh yeah, you're gonna do that. Now that I'm in my 40s, I'm like, good for you, way to go, holy shit, because I know what they probably went through to get to that thing, you know, to just get to that thing, the open mics and the bombing and the like having to keep carrying on, even though you're like, want to give up. And you know what I mean? To me, holy God, anyone out there who has managed to like live off of their art, oh, wow, good for you. Do I think they're all funny? Fuck no. You know what I mean? Do I watch some of their stuff and think does not appeal to me? But God, I have terrible taste. You know what I mean? Like, what's my taste? I'm just one of zillions of people on the planet. But when you're younger, you think you're somehow like you imagine yourself. I imagine myself to be like like somehow like an arbiter of art or something. It's really dumb. You know, I'm particularly dumb in so many ways. But now I don't think that anymore. Now it's just like, oh, holy fucking shit. You're feeding your kids, you know, with your acting or your comedy or whatever. That's pretty cool.
So let's talk about Burning Man a little bit. How many times have you been? First of all, I've heard you talk about it, but I don't know the details. Twice. What years did you go?
I don't remember. I'm bad with years.
That's fine.
I know from the shape of the temples. I went to the one where the guy ran into the man.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I don't know what year that was.
I think that was like 2015 or something, somewhere around then.
I didn't go to the year before that, and I went to the year before that one. So those are the two I went to.
Did you have any big takeaways from your time at Burning Man?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
What takeaways did you have from
Burning Man's a guru? Burning Man's a guru. It's a guru. The whole fucking festival is a guru. And so you go there and it's you know, it's like it'll teach you. It teaches you all about yourself. And you know, it's a you know, it's an incredibly powerful artistic community. It's incredible. And so yeah, I had a lot of takeaways from Burning Man.
For me, my first time I went my senior year of high school, and then like you, I took a year off, and then I went by myself the year after that. And the first time I went with one of my best friends, and we roamed around together. We had a great time, and we were, you know, teenagers in high school, and we were like, this is the pinnacle of society. Like, this is great. The whole world needs to be like this, you know. And I really like built it up in this pedestal in my head of like, this is the place. This is like, I got to get back to Burning Man. And then I took a year off, like I said, and then I went back by myself in 2011, kind of like being like, yeah, I'm finally going back. Like, it's, you know, and I got there and it was maybe the second night or something. I made a couple friends, you know, I met up with a couple groups. I wasn't like totally alone, but like I ended up getting some LSD from somebody and getting on this real like personal trip where I basically realized that I had to leave Burning Man. And like my message was basically like, yeah, there's something here, but I can't keep coming back here for it. I have to take it and bring it out to the world. And that was kind of my big takeaway from Burning Man.
That's cool. That's cool, man. Yeah. I mean, there's so many, what I love about it is like anybody who tries to, in their description of it, tries to assign to it one characteristic is like, it's so many different things are going on there and so many different communities and so many different like reasons for being there.
Yeah. You think you'll go back again? Are you planning to go back again, or you think that's something you've experienced?
Going back this summer, going back.
Nice.
Right now I plan to go back, but I have to I don't know. We'll see. I love being around my kids. So, and I go on the road so much that it's like being away from them for that long that I don't know if I will be able to enjoy it as much because I'm going to miss them so much.
All right. I'm gonna toss a couple of quotes towards you from people that you and I both know, and see what you think of these quotes in the context of the crazy world we're living in these days.
Okay, cool.
One thing that Ram Dass said, a famous Ram Dass quote, is the quieter you become, the more you hear. In light of that, I feel like there's also a balance in terms of like using your voice and the value of something like speaking up on a podcast. Where do you find the balance between these two things?
I don't. I mean, fucking kidding? You know what Ram Dass, you know the spiritual advice Ram Dass gave me? Get therapy. That's what he said to me. You know, I'm in therapy right now. I'm yappy. So now, I mean, I love that quote. Now, sometimes I'll think about it and be like, well, one day. But I do love that quote. It's really cool.
Fair enough. The other one I wanted to ask you about was a Terrance McKenna quote. Terrance McKenna once said, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I sure can.
Okay. Terrance McKenna once said that the inability, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something along the lines of
you have to paraphrase Terrance McKenna. You're going to read
something along the lines of the reason why we haven't achieved peace yet is because the artist has not yet created a song that unites the world. Do you think that that's true? And do you think what's stopping us from writing the song?
Give me a fucking break. That's a very poetic thing to say. And I think it's a beautiful thing to say. But I don't think that's real. No, that is not real. That is not real. It's a beautiful idea.
Do you think peace is something we can achieve?
Yes.
Or do you think it's just a lofty dream?
Yeah, we can achieve peace 100%. I think it's one of the most important questions to ask yourself if you think world peace is possible. It's one of the first questions you should ask yourself in contemplating what you have to do here on the planet. If you think world peace is not possible, then go fuck off. You know, I don't mean you can just go fuck off. You know what I mean? Not like I want you to fuck up. I mean, like, all right, yeah, you're right. Then there's really like, yeah, there's not much for you to do in terms of trying to help whatever that particular whoever is involved in that particular activity, bringing peace to the world. But yeah, so I do think world peace is most certainly possible.
Then how do we get there when so much is out of our control?
Well, you know, if I knew the fucking answer to that, I'd be Ted Kaczynski thought the answer was mail bombs. You know what I mean? Like,
Duncan, I was really hoping you could solve all the world's problems for me on this podcast.
No. I wish I tell you this, if I could, I would. If I knew the answer, I'd get it out there. If I thought I could do it, I would do it. I would do it. But I don't think, you know, this is for me, I refer to another Ram Dass quote, which is, we work on ourselves so we can help those around us. And so I think that for me, I don't know how world peace is possible. How could I? I don't know how to give, I can't really achieve lasting Duncan peace. So if I can't achieve Duncan peace in my own heart, then how could I prescribe some method for the whole planet? That would be only like, wow, man, I'm dumb, but I'm not that dumb. And which is why I think Jesus said, you know, before you criticize your brother for the speck of dust in their eye, get the log out of your eye, get the stake out of your eye first. And so to me, there's something really pragmatic about that line of thinking, because if we start thinking too much about world peace, when our own lives are turbulent and confused, and when we're still caught up in our own karmic sort of loops, then it's only going to make us anxious, you know? So
I love the way you tied those things together, because I think that right now there's, at least I've picked up on a big conversation in the zeitgeist that's kind of about like individualism versus collectivism, and like that kind of sense of like, do people, especially like, you know, like privileged people, like spend too much time worrying on their own self like actualization versus like trying to make things better for the whole. But I think the way that you pointed out how those things are interconnected, there's something really important to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but yeah, the critique of that way of thinking, and a very fair critique, is that it would be easy to do spiritual bypass and imagine that the project of one's own inner peace, or I guess this fucking cult of self-care is all there is. I mean, then all of a sudden, what are you taking? You're taking like 15 lavender baths every day or whatever, and getting your like chakras vibrated or something like that, and then it turns into this very indulgent way of being that's really rotten, in the sense that at least like if someone's just being indulgent and getting hammered or doing some kind of like materialistic thing, at least they're like, yeah, motherfucker, I want a fast car and I want to wear these clothes and I don't know, this is what I'm into. But to add to that, I'm doing it to save the world. You know what I mean? That's gross. That's gross. Like I think that's totally fucked up. So I think that what's cool about calming down a little bit and being engaged in any kind of activity that gives you a little more compassion for yourself, as a natural byproduct, the social activities can start appearing. A desire to like help other people starts showing up naturally, instead of like that guilty feeling. I don't know if you ever have that, but like, like you have your friends and they're always working at like a food bank or something. And you're like, oh God, I should do that. What's wrong with me? I got to get to a food bank or whatever. I'm a selfish piece of shit, right? I'll go do it. Then you're doing it out of all this selfishness or whatever. You know what I mean? You're all this guilt. But sometimes the spontaneous just desire to like help in whatever way you can will start appearing. Now that's great. That being said, if you wait for that feeling, you're going to take a lot of lavender baths. Like sometimes you need to, even if you don't feel that way, get the fuck out there and do something.
Yeah, that's very true. I'm going to take us out of the high-minded philosophical stuff for a minute and bring us back down to the physical reality. I gave you a rain-activated street art kit when I saw you at the show. Were you able to get that back across from on the plane? I knew you were flying back.
It. It's in a cabinet
right now.
Yeah, we haven't done it yet. But I remember.
Good. I'm glad.
Something you told me, if I did your podcast, what would you do?
I'm going to make you a custom stencil. And I wanted to ask you if you have thought about what you would like to have as a stencil.
Yeah, well, I'm still thinking about it because it's going to be for the kids. So I'm still thinking about it.
I'm also happy to make you more than one. I say a custom stencil, but I'll make you a few. Man.
Okay, great. Well, that changes. Like, I will let you know. I've thought about it briefly because like my kids are going to flip their shit over it. So it's like I have to think about like something that they're going to think is really funny and cool. And then I'll let you know. But they're, kids are they're into like only a few very specific things anyway. Spider-Man, Paw Patrol, you know what I mean? I don't know. So maybe probably a Spider-Man, something to do with, but that
could look really cool. Spider webs would look really cool in that medium.
Something like that.
I support it. Cool, man. Well, I don't want to take too much of your time. You've really done a great job of answering like a lot of heavy questions that I threw at you.
Thanks for having me on. You're a great interviewer. Keep doing it.
Thank you.
Keep doing it. I did not.
This has
how long have you
been so motivating for me.
How long have you been podcasting?
Technically, I recorded my first one in October of last year. So it's been about 6 months, but it's very fresh.
Keep it up. Keep it up.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed chatting with you. Thank you so much for having me on. And let me know when it's up so I can tweet it or whatever.
I definitely will. And I would love to get to chat again sometime down the line. Thank you so much, Duncan. Yeah, sure. Once again, I'll let you go.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'll see you. Are you coming to Burning Man this year?
We'll see. We'll see. Too early to tell.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll see it. All right. I'll see you later. Great chatting.
Cool. Take care. Thanks, Duncan.
Bye.
Bye. All right. That's that. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're new to this channel, please check out some of my other videos. I think you'll really dig them. Duncan, if you're watching this, thank you so much for taking the time out to have this conversation with me. It really meant a lot. I hope you didn't end up feeling like you were playing the role of my therapist too much, but it was genuinely super cool to hear your take on the ideas that have been bouncing around my head. And to the audience out there, thank you guys for watching. Give me some feedback. What did you think of this kind of personal, all over the place interview style? Did you like it? Do you prefer if I go back to the more topic focused episodes? I'd love feedback. Leave me a comment. Let me know. I'm just throwing ideas against the wall right now and seeing what sticks. So this entire project is a work in progress. Let's see where it goes. That's all for now. Hit the thumbs up if you liked it. Leave me a comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you guys. I'll see you next time.